Every time I hear this story of Jesus feeding 5,000, I'm struck by that line. You give them something to eat. The disciples came to Jesus asking him to solve a problem, or at least a problem as they saw it. It was late. They're out in the middle of nowhere, and Jesus is the reason all those hungry crowds are there. So Jesus, they say, send the crowds away. Perhaps lying beneath their request is that they know that they only have enough food for themselves, and they want the crowds to go buy some food, buy their own food. Could it be possible that they didn't want to share? Or maybe were they afraid that if they shared, they wouldn't get enough to eat? Jesus is not buying it. You give them something to eat. Perhaps lying beneath his response is, you've got food here, share it. To which the disciples reply, we have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. I imagine Jesus rolling his eyes and saying, nothing? 5 loaves and 2 fish is something. Give them to me. And then he took and blessed and broke those bread, those loaves, and gave them back to the disciples. I hope that pattern sounds a little familiar to us, who in turn gave them to the crowds. In other words, Jesus fulfilled his own command. You give them something to eat. Jesus made it possible for the disciples to feed the people. Jesus didn't do it. He empowered his friends do. They shared what they had, and by their example, they invited everyone to share in the divine abundance. I wonder if we might better call this story, Jesus shows his disciples how to feed 5,000. Taking, blessing, breaking, sharing. That pattern probably sounds familiar because what we have here is Eucharist. We haven't reached the Last Supper yet, the story that we most often remember when we celebrate Eucharist. But there is more to Eucharist than what happened on the night before Jesus died. And notice the difference here between that story of the Last Supper and this story of the feeding of so many people. In this story, the purpose of that taking, blessing, breaking, sharing isn't so much to remember Jesus' death than it is to empower his friends to do as he did, to model and embody the reality that God has provided more than enough to feed everyone, 12 baskets more, including and especially the women and the children. And while the Last Supper was something shared just among Jesus' close companions, at least as we tell it, this Eucharistic story of the multitudes imagines an open table where everyone is welcome to eat. What a contradiction to the world we are living in, where the main story we hear and sometimes tell and sometimes live by is that there is not enough for everyone. So much so that we need to hoard, that we need to build walls, throw up roadblocks, ration everything, food, medicine, healthcare, citizenship, education. And there are so many ways to ration, whether at borders or based on race or class or language. What would it be like if we Christians walked through our lives every single day repeating, there is enough, so much more than enough of everything? How might we allow Jesus to empower us to do as those disciples did, to take what we have, bless and break it, and then share it with everyone? What would our Sunday Eucharist look like if we added this story to our weekly remembrance of Jesus? Or how might this story help us to recognize Eucharist in all kinds of places beyond our Sunday gathering? After all, we haven't technically celebrated Eucharist together in church since March, unless you count last Tuesday night, when God's abundance in the form of chili and bread and vegetables went out our doors to feed more than 80 people. We're on our way to that 5,000. And perhaps here is one of the gifts that God wants to give us as we wrestle, as Jacob did, with God in this pandemic time. It can be easy, I think, to allow our worship to be just that, a beautiful offering of word and song and symbol that expresses our wonder before God's mystery. The danger, I worry, is that sometimes that gets a bit too holy, too religious, and a little bit focused on us. We use bread that's made so unusual for church that it doesn't really look like bread anymore, much less taste like it. We use plates and cups and napkins that are beautiful but don't really reflect how we set our own tables. And sometimes we gather at a table made so distant that we call it an altar instead. All that can make it hard to remember that what we now call Eucharist began among many of the first Christians as a meal at a home table from which the poor were fed. As wonderful as so much of our worship can be, I think it's possible that it can distract us from the work that worship is shaping us to do in the world. There is a reason we call it liturgy, which can mean both people's work and public service done for everyone. A primary purpose of our gathering is always to form us and send us to join God's work in the world, of proclaiming in everything that we do that there is enough, more than enough, 12 baskets full. This month, we are including a blessing of food and drink here in our Zoom service, an echo of what some of those early Christians did as they were experimenting their way to the common prayers we now take for granted. What might Jesus be inviting us to explore or learn or remember as we bless God for this abundance, so that we might take Jesus up on his invitation? You give them something to eat.